Jesse in Montana, you're on the Ben Shapiro Show. Go for it, Jesse.
Hello. Thanks for taking the call.
Sure.
I've been listening to you for about 4 years now. You were about a couple of years ago. You were actually my gateway into kind of getting into philosophy a little bit.
Oh, great.
Been listening to a lot. I've been really enjoying it. Your show, I actually think, is at its best when you kind of let Judeo-Christian principles and philosophy kind of bleed in to the substance. But anyway, I'm a non-denominational libertarian Christian.
Mm-hmm.
I'm kind of in this like bit of a circular logic that I can't really get out of. Maybe you could enlighten me a little bit. I'm in this place where I think that you actually can't find any real objective morality without God or a creator.
Okay.
But I'm also in this place where, like, what if there's a hypothetical where a God or a creator asks you or instructs you to do something immoral?
Right.
So we could take something really basic, like what if God tells you to kill a baby or something like that?
Right.
So
exactly.
If morality is only objective, if God says so, what if he would then tell you to do something immoral, like by our standards?
Right. So this has been called for a long time the Euthyphro dilemma from Plato's Republic. The basic idea being that what if God is the source of all morality and God tells you to do something wrong, then he isn't the actual source of all morality. So in the Bible, this is mostly dealt with in sort of the Judeo-Christian heritage. This is mostly dealt with in the story of Abraham and Isaac, right? Which is a horrifying story on its surface. And this is why Richard Dawkins, the famed atheist, picks it sort of out of the biblical pile and says, well, this is a perfect example of what biblical morality looks like. God telling a father to kill his son, to murder his son, and this is treated as a great sign of faith by people of faith. Well, to me, that is a dramatic misread of what the Abraham and Isaac story is about. Basically, what that story is about, and you can find this in the text pretty easily, is Abraham acknowledging that God's authority is sacrosanct, but also trusting that God is not going to force him to do something immoral. Because on the surface of it, God's request to Abraham is so bizarre. First of all, Abraham, in sort of Jewish theology, had always been rebelling against the greatest of all sins, which was the sacrifice of children to pagan gods. I mean, the Bible itself bans the killing of children for the god Moloch, right? I mean, it literally says this in the Bible. So the idea that God would then tell Abraham to kill his own child is bizarre to Abraham, but Abraham doesn't argue, right? Abraham argues with God on a number of occasions. Most specifically, he argues with God about the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. He says, well, if you can find this many righteous people and this many righteous people, you shouldn't go forward with it. And God accepts the logic. And then when no righteous people are there to be found, then he destroys the city. But but in this circumstance, Abraham doesn't actually argue with God about what would seem to be the most immoral thing, right? God telling him to kill his only son. The only way to explain that from a Judeo-Christian perspective is to say that Abraham had enough trust in God to understand that God was testing Abraham's willingness to obey authority and Abraham's faith that God would be doing the right thing, that God would not force him to go through with the actual murder of his own son. Now, where that comes down in terms of Judeo-Christian faith is from a sort of realistic perspective. There are many times in life in which circumstance forces horrible things upon us, and we sort of just have to accept them as an element of the universe, as an element of God's justice that we don't understand. But we have faith that God is acting morally even when he appears to be acting immorally. And in this case, when the choice is made explicit by God himself, God is the one who changes his mind, or maybe he didn't change his mind in the first place. Maybe he never meant to go through with it in the first place. So the problem of, is man's morality sacrosanct or is God's morality sacrosanct? The point that I've always made about Judeo-Christian morality is that Judeo-Christian morality rests on certain fundamental premises that you simply have to assume in order to even discern a moral system. So both natural law systems of thought and Talmudic systems of thought assume that you can actually learn basic things about morality from the world around us based on certain premises that you have to accept. Those premises cannot be found in science. The sacrosanct nature of human life is a perfectly obvious one. The inestimable value of every human life. So the most important sentence in human history, in my view, is the sentence from Genesis in which God says that man was made in his image. This was a change from prior systems of thought, and you can read ancient pagan religion in which they talk about the king being made in God's image, but human beings generally were not seen to be made in God's image. That created a sort of species equality. Number one, that human beings are all equal to each other in terms of the rights that they have from God, and in terms of in terms of the value that they have before God, and also in terms of the inability to violate somebody else's right to life, for example. That's not something that you can find in evolutionary biology. This is always the question that I've asked Sam Harris and other atheists who believe that you can discern a certain level of morality simply from the world around them. What in evolutionary biology suggests that an individual human life is worth anything. Nothing in evolutionary biology suggests anything remotely like that. You have to take as given that individual human lives are worth something in order to build a moral system from that. And that has to be based, it has to be predicated on the innate stature of an individual human life. And religion makes this clear by saying, well, God made human beings in his image and therefore they have inestimable value. You can then discern a system of morality from that. Now, when that comes in conflict with what you believe to be values given by God, then you have to determine, are you really properly interpreting the values that have been given by God, or are you possibly attempting to override God's values with your own? And this is why sometimes people will look. I'm an Orthodox Jew, right? So I keep this stuff pretty strictly. People will look at the Bible and they'll pick things out and they'll say, well, what about this seemingly ridiculous position? And what I've always said, and the Talmud makes this clear too, even in Judaic thought, is that there are certain sort of eternal principles about human nature that are embedded in the Bible, and those are things that are discernible from the text of the Bible. And then there are things that are sort of time-bound commandments and commandments of the time and exigencies of the time, and we have to determine that. So I've never believed in the fulsome sort of non-logic based approach to religion. Neither did Maimonides in Judaism or Thomas Aquinas in Christianity. God gave a document. If you're a Bible believer, God gave a document of morality to human beings, knowing that human beings were then going to apply their own logic to that document. God knew that, and he expected that. And in fact, he wanted that to happen, because otherwise he theoretically could have frozen humanity in place at the time. So morality is not above God, but we do trust in God to abide by a morality that he gave us in the first place, right? God gave us our moral sense. I mean, even Immanuel Kant, who was not exactly a purely religious philosopher, suggested that he found evidence of God in man's innate sort of moral sensibility, which was embedded, and then we were given certain basic premises that are not discernible from the pure materialistic world around us. Jesse.
Thank you. Appreciate it. That basically answered my question.
I appreciate it. Thanks. I always like philosophy questions, so I'm glad that you asked one.
I love your Torah reads on Friday night, on the end of your Friday shows, by the way.
Oh, that's very sweet of you. Thank you. Well, we'll try and get back to that on tomorrow's show. Really appreciate the call. Kurt in Burnsville, Minnesota. You're on the Ben Shapiro Show. Go for it, Kurt.
Hey, Ben. Just want to tell you I'm a big fan of your show. Follow you on Facebook and all that good stuff. And I was actually watching something a couple days ago. It talks about how the presidential candidate, Bernie Sanders, says that he's a democratic socialist. I think that's kind of funny because there basically is no difference between a regular socialist and a democratic socialist, correct?
Well, the problem is they refuse to define the term. So they'll say democratic socialist, and what you're supposed to read from that is that we are talking about Norway or Denmark, and we are not talking about Cuba or Venezuela or the Soviet Union. But of course, the People's Republic of North Korea says it is a people's republic, right? Just because you call yourself a democratic socialist does not mean that you are necessarily democratic. What do you mean by democratic? The modifier democratic only means that you like voting sometimes, but not every time. And also, democratic used to mean, sort of in common parlance, democratic used to mean one of two things. Either you're a pure majoritarian, meaning you think we should vote on everything, which is an immoral system, right? It is an immoral system. If you believe that all rights are subject to the basic whim of a majority, you can very easily end up with the slaughter of minority by a majority. You can easily end up with Jim Crow. You can end up with slavery. Obviously, democracy in and of itself is not inherently moral. The question of democracy, the reason that democracy is moral, if it is moral, is because it recognizes individual rights. So democracy without individual rights is inherently undemocratic in certain basic ways. So that's why the phrase democratic socialist is always sort of a misnomer. If Democrats were honest about this, or if Bernie were honest, he would just call himself a social democrat, right? A social democrat is a person who believes in free markets and then believes in heavy social strictures on top of that, social welfare programs. That would be Norway or Denmark. And social democrats in these countries call themselves social democrats. They don't call themselves democratic socialists. There is a difference between the two terms. Calling themselves democratic socialists means that you reject the profit motive. It means you reject the free market. And Bernie wants to kind of grab the mantle of radical while at the same time sort of distancing himself from the mantle of radical by suggesting that what he really only means is a bigger government superstructure, which, by the way, is no different from FDR or LBJ. So this has always been the weird thing about Bernie, is what exactly is he? And he refuses to say exactly what. Back in the 70s, he said clearly what he was. He was a communist, right? He was a full-on socialist, state-run business communist. Now he sort of wants to be halfway. He doesn't really want to define it. But when someone says democratic socialist, you need to ask them, are you talking about government ownership of the means of production? End of story. That is the question, right? Because socialism is that. And then if you mean that you're going to do that via democracy, then you're still talking about the violation of individual rights. the vagary in the terms is how socialists get away with couching their more radical viewpoints in the rhetoric of consent of the people. When again, you cannot consent to the violation of your own individual rights, Kurt.
So do you think that Bernie is basically trying to get more votes by saying oh no, I'm not a socialist, I'm a democratic socialist? Do you think he's just trying to get more votes by trying to change the words so that way more people will vote for him?
Yes. So what he's doing is he's saying to his base, I am a socialist, and then he is saying to everybody else, I'm a democratic socialist, so I'm not really scary. And the reason that he insists on calling himself a socialist is because he wants a label distinction between himself and Elizabeth Warren, or between himself and Pete Buttigieg, because the fact is that if you look at their actual policies, Elizabeth Warren's policies, she calls herself a non-socialist. Right? Elizabeth Warren's policies are indistinguishable from Bernie's. They're very, very close on every level. And the same thing is basically true of Pete Buttigieg, with very minor distinctions. So what Bernie does is he wants the branding separation of socialism without having to live with the reality, which is that socialism is a cruel, unjust, and evil system that has failed everywhere it has actually been tried in terms of government ownership of the means of production. Kurt, really appreciate the call. Andre in San Antonio, Texas, you're on the Ben Shapiro Show. Go for it, Andre.
Thank you for taking my call, Ben.
Sure, go for it.
So my question is, the federal executive branch has over 3 million employees, 1.2 of which are non-military. Do you think it would be a good idea to split the executive branch into more than one elected individual? For example, the Texas executive branch has 9 elected positions. And to be clear, I am asking because I think the unelected officials in the cabinet positions are getting too powerful, not because I think the president's position itself is too powerful.
So this was considered by the founders, right? So the founders actually talk about in the Federalist Papers the idea of either a rotating executive or a shared power of executive. And the reason they came up with a singular executive is because they wanted the executive to be able to act with alacrity and act quickly. The idea of having elected officials in the executive branch, more than one, I could see the case for it, I suppose, if you wanted diffusion of authority, so long as those people are able to be recalled if they're elected individually. If it creates more gridlock, frankly, at this point, I'm in favor of it. So more gridlock in the executive branch sounds great to me. I mean, the idea of an executive branch where the AG is at odds with the president, who is also at odds with the Secretary of State, like, I'm not sure that that's a terrible thing. I think on a federal level, when it comes to foreign policy, that's a problem. I think on a state level, it's less of a problem. You also presumably don't want the AG constantly going after the governor of a state, for example, having them be different members of different parties and have them completely at odds. I see the upsides, I see the downsides, but I could see the argument for it. I'd be willing to hear the argument for it, Andre. I really appreciate the call. Daniel in New Jersey, you're on the Ben Shapiro Show. Go for it, Daniel.
Yeah, how are you today, Mr. Shapiro? My question is actually a little straight out of the headlines.
Sure.
Today, the House voted to remove a previously existing and extended ratification deadlines for the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment. Congress can extend deadlines that haven't yet passed, but do you think they should be able to remove ones that expired?
No, of course.
In addition to that, Ginsburg.
Yeah, go ahead, Daniel.
Oh, sorry. I was going to.
No, I got so excited about your question, I just jumped in. But I mean, the reality is that, of course, this is insane. This is completely insane. Okay, if a law expires and then you're like, oh, well, we just revived it magically without like a full vote of the Senate in the way that you normally do a constitutional amendment, so it's back on the table. And all of the states that voted for this thing back in 1978, it's like they voted for it today. Like, are politics different in 1978 than they are today? A little. Okay, so when they passed the Equal Rights Amendment, there was a natural expiration date on the Equal Rights Amendment. It expired. You don't just get to undo the past by going, whoops, we unexpired it. And it turns out that all the states who voted that year based on the expiration of the ERA, we'll just count them. We'll just count them. That's not the way any of this crap works, right? Notorious RBG, who is worshipped by the left. They turned on her this week because she pointed out what is perfectly obvious. Apparently, while RBG is very bad at reading the Constitution, she's still capable of reading basic English, because obviously this is not constitutional. Obviously, you cannot just undo a dead letter. It's just ridiculous, Daniel. It's ridiculous on its face.
Yeah, that was actually exactly what the second part of my question was going to get into. But in furtherance of that, do you think that she would actually pose a fifth vote, assuming the 4 Republican-nominated justices voted together, to uphold what the OLC said, that the deadline passed, this thing's dead?
No, I don't trust her at all. No, I don't trust RBG, to be honest, on this thing at all. If I trusted RBG, to be honest, then I'd have a lot more faith in our Supreme Court. I have a feeling that RBG would then go, well, I think that this is really this is really bad. Well, I think she said, I would like to see a new beginning. I'd like to see it start over. There's too much controversy about latecomers, Virginia, long after the deadline passed. But she might say, well, but in reality, the controversy is actually over evolving standards of decency and all that. I'd go for, I just don't trust RBG. But she obviously is speaking the truth when she says that the deadline is over. It's ridiculous. I mean, this is just ridiculous garbage, Daniel.
She was absolutely decent enough to recognize that not only were there latecomers supporting it, but those who supported it before the 78 or 82 deadline, 79 or 82 deadlines actually have rescinded their ratification.
Right. Well, that is true as well.
While proponents will say that they can't do that, Ginsburg said, well, if we're going to count the ones who come in, we have to count the ones who want out. So I don't know where the math even stands.
Listen, I hope, I'm less sanguine about people's honesty than I was when I was younger. And I get more and more cynical as the days go by. But at the same time, I mean, what she said on this is absolutely true. Daniel, really appreciate the call. Zedki in Algeria, you're on the Ben Shapiro Show. Go for it, Zedki.
Hello, Ben. First of all, I would like to say that I'm a huge fan of your show for quite a while now, and this is coming from someone living in a totally far country. My question is about socialism, right? I just don't understand why in a country such as America, people still advocate an idea like socialism, and this is coming from a person that's experiencing its bad consequences like firsthand. I don't understand how come intellectual people and politicians still advocate such an idea despite the overwhelming evidence that it's just not correct and it's a bad idea.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it comes down to a couple things. First of all, socialism, like true socialism, is very popular in areas where it has not actually been effectuated. People from socialist countries understand that you have to flee socialism to free countries. People in free countries are like, wouldn't it be nice if there were a brotherhood of man and things were different than they are? Socialism is just basically a buzzword for utopian scheming, and that's very easy to do in a country where things are fairly prosperous and free. I think beyond that, socialists in the West have done an excellent job of obscuring their actual positions. So what they will do is they'll say, well, I'm not a socialist, I'm a democratic socialist. I'm not a socialist, I'm a syndicalist. I'm not a socialist, I'm a person who believes in free healthcare for everybody. And it's like, well, no, you need to explain what you mean. Do you mean government ownership of the means of production? That is the definition of socialism. If you are suggesting that socialism just means being fair or nice to each other, no, I'm also for being fair and nice to each other. If you mean that the government gets to cram down on everybody else how businesses are run, that the government gets to decide on the redistribution of all resources for purposes of fairness, then we got a problem on our hands. And if people were honest, we could discuss gradations of this stuff, because there are gradations, right? I mean, the fact is that you can have a socialist system in a capitalist economy. The National Health Service in Britain is a great example of a socialist system in a capitalist economy. And you can talk about whether that's effective, whether that's ineffective, whether there are better systems or worse. But instead, when people say socialist, what they really mean is just a buzzword for utopia, and buzzwords for utopia never match the reality of utopian attempts that generally fall flat.
Yeah, I get that. But, many times, I try to speak with people that advocate such ideas, and we get shut down. We are experiencing socialism, and they're advocating for it. And, we try to ask them questions, what we are doing wrong here. What you're saying is not the same as what we are living. What we are doing wrong that is affecting our lives so badly. I mean, if you have cancer here, you can get free treatment, but it's mediocre treatment. You know what I mean? They kind of deny us. They don't even let us talk.
No, that's right. One of the keys about socialism is that you make sure that nobody can actually. It's like Fight Club. The first rule of socialism is that when you're in the socialist club, you're not allowed to talk about socialism. And that's what you're seeing in. It's like what you're seeing in communist China right now, right? The first rule of communist China is never talk about how bad communist China is. So Zedki, really appreciate your call. And thanks for listening from abroad. Really appreciate it. Let's see. One more question. Let's see. Jake in Poway, California. You're on the Ben Shapiro Show. Go for it, Jake.
Hey, Ben. How are you?
Hey, doing well. Go for it, sir.
Right on. My question is regarding the polarization between the two parties. Since there's such a great divide between these two great political entities, in a sense to where the left has drifted so far away from themselves. I mean, I entertain the Milton Friedman version of what a true liberal is.
Right.
The fact that they've drifted so far away from their political party is to infringe on the Constitution.
Yeah, Jake, I mean, I think that the bottom line is that when it comes to polarization, we're going to need to rediscover the roots of the country, and we're going to need to address what we have in common. Right now, the answer is not very much. So unless we find something in common, whether it is belief in founding principles, whether it is even a common cultural sort of sphere that we occupy, we're going to need something. Otherwise, this is just going to keep coming apart.